There's something about Pendle Hill. Even now, after centuries have passed, the wind that snakes around its slopes feels different. It tugs at your coat, whispers through the trees, crawls up your spine like it remembers things you do not. People say it's just a trick of the weather, but those who live in its shadow, they know better. They say the hills hold memories, that it remembers what happened here, what was said, what was believed, and what was done. In 1612, the names of 12 women and 1 man echoed across the country. Whispers turned to accusations, accusations to confessions. And by the summer's end, the gallows would creak beneath the weight of those condemned, not by proof, but by fear. And this wasn't just a story of witches. It was a story of poverty, of rivalry, of a land divided by faith. It was the story of a child who would send her entire family to the noose, of healers turned into monsters, of how a single word, witch, could destroy everything. So tonight we follow that wind, we'll listen to what's been carried through the centuries, and we ask, who were the witches of Pendle Hill? Welcome to the Lorekeepers Library. The year is 1612. Lancashire is a land of contrast. Rolling hills and rural helmets lie beneath the shadow of Pendle Hill, a place already steeped in legend, but is also land marked by religious upheaval. You see, England's Reformation is fresh in memory, and Catholic, they are still being hunted. Loyalty to the Crown means loyalty to the Church of England, and suspicion falls easily on those who practice otherwise. King James I sits on the throne, a man obsessed with rooting out witchcraft. He's already published Demonology, a guidebook for identifying witches and devils. And his word has become law, and his paranoia contagious. Witch hunting has become a tool not just of faith, but of control. And in Lancashire, one spark would soon ignite a wildfire. It began as many tragic tales do, with something small on a brisk morning near a village of Colne. Alizon Device, a young woman of around 20, is walking the road. Her family, poor, marginalised, survives through begging, healing and the old ways. Folk magic, charms, remedies, handed down by sacred law. She crosses paths of a peddler, John Law, travelling merchant selling goods. Alizon asks him for some pins. Now to us, pins might seem like a minor request, but in the 17th century they were valuable, used for fastening clothing and also in folk magic, to pierce clay effigies, to draw blood and to seal charms. John Law refuses and something happens. A moment after the exchange, Law collapses. He's unable to speak and half his body is paralysed. He's taken to an inn in Colne, where word spreads fast. He's been struck down by a witch. Alizon is sent for, and this is where the story truly begins. You see, she confesses. According to contemporary records, Alizon not only admits to bewitching John Law, but she also begs his forgiveness. She weeps. She claims she called upon a familiar spirit to hurt him in a moment of anger. Whether she truly believed it or feared what might happen if she denied it, it remains a mystery. But her confession is heard by Roger Knoll, the local magistrate, and this is when the wheels truly start to turn. Alizon doesn't speak for herself. She names others. Her grandmother, Elizabeth Southerns, known across Pendle as Old Demdike, her neighbour and family rival, Anne Whittle, called Chattox. And more names follow, stories, confessions, accusations exchanged like currency. The area was already heavy with rumour. Old Demdike had long been feared and respected as a cunning woman, Chattox too. and they had a reputation for curses and malice. But reputation wasn't guilt. Not yet. What followed wasn't a matter of justice. It was a chain reaction. And Alizon's trembling confession was the match that lit the flame. In the dim, cold chambers of Lancaster Castle, time moved slowly. And yet it only took herbs, charms, and protective rites. She straddled the line between healer and witch. To the folk of Pendle, she was a protector and a threat. But in front of Roger Nowell, Demdike said something no one expected. She confessed. According to court clerk Thomas Potts, in The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, Demdike admitted she'd given her soul to the devil 20 years earlier. She described her familiar, Tib, who appeared in the form of a handsome young man and promised her power. I gave him my soul, and he promised I should have my will. I was to call him by the name Tib. Whether these were words of delusional elderly woman or coerced confession, or simply a performance for survival, we'll never truly know. But once a person confessed, the others seemed to follow. Anne Whittle, known as Chattox, and her daughter Anne Redfern were next. They were Demdike's rivals, living nearby in their own decaying cottage. The families had accused each other of witchcraft for years, stealing goods, poisoning ale, causing illness. Now those long-standing feuds turned lethal. Chattox, described by Potts as old withered hag, also confessed to selling her soul to a black spirit. She said she did it out of fear, after a chance meeting with the devil who threatened her life unless she complied. She also spoke of clay figures, effigies used in sympathetic magic, moulded and pierced to bring sickness and death. Her daughter, Anne, was accused of making them. Yet while the old woman spoke with resignation, Anne denied her guilt. She held firm, the early interrogations refusing to admit to things she did not do. But in an age where denial could be seen as proof of devilish stubbornness, even silence was a threat. These weren't anonymous names to one another. They were neighbours, rivals, family. The Demdikes and the Chattoxes had quarrelled for generations, but now the stakes were higher. These accusations weren't just social slights or folk gossip, they were potentially fatal. Alizon Device, herself still grieving over John Law's stroke, continued to speak, adding fuel to the fire. She implicated her own brother, James Device, and her sister Jennet, and even her mother, Elizabeth Device. According to Alizon, witchcraft ran in the bloodline, and perhaps she believed that. Perhaps it's what she'd always been told. The irony is sharp. In trying to explain the curse she believed she caused, Alizon may have unwittingly doomed her entire family, and the pressure only grew worse when a second wave of accusations came. Not from adults, but from a child. April 10th, 1612, Good Friday. For most of England, it was a sacred day, one of prayer, fasting and silence. But at the base of Pendle Hill, in a sagging, smoke-darkened cottage, known as Malkin Tower, a different kind of gathering was taking place. The head of the household, Elizabeth Device, was alone now. Her mother, old Demdike, had been taken to Lancaster. Her daughter, Alizon, too. She was desperate, frightened, and very likely aware of what might happen next. So she called a meeting. Who exactly came to Malkin Tower that day remains debated. But according to the written accounts of Thomas Potts, the court clerk who would later publish the official record, it was a meeting of clearly. When she pointed at Alizon Device and accused her of witchcraft, her mother shrieked and collapsed in hysterics. Jennet didn't just name her family. She named Alice Nutter, a wealthy widow and landowner, Catherine Hewitt, John Balcock, Jane Balcock, Alice Gray, and others were also implicated. Some may have attended the gathering, others, perhaps, were simply named to add weight to the accusation. And here lies one of the greatest tragedies of Pendle. This wasn't merely a hunt for witches, it became a purge of the unwanted, the inconvenient, the feared. The poor were targeted for their traditions, the wealthy for their independence, and even a child's voice, frightened, manipulated, or believing every word she said, could seal a fate. By the end of April, 10 more people were arrested, based largely on Jennet's testimony. They joined the others already awaiting trial in the damp, disease-ridden cells of Lancaster Castle. One name, however, would never stand trial. Old Demdike, the woman whose whispered knowledge had stirred both awe and terror in the hills of Pendle, died in prison before her case was heard. Her confession recorded, her legacy stained. But the others, they were not so lucky. The gallows were waiting. The summer of 1612 was unusually grim in Lancaster. The air was thick with smoke from chimneys and gossip from taverns. Across the north, tongues wagged with stories of witchcraft, devilry, and dark sabbaths beneath Pendle Hill. And at the heart of it all, Lancaster Castle, a fortress that now held not just criminals, but 13 accused witches. On August the 18th, the trials began. It's important to understand that these were not secretive inquisitions held behind closed doors. No, the Pendle witch trials were public, theatrical events. Crowds came to watch, lords and magistrates came to pass judgment, and at the centre of it all stood Sir Edward Bromley, presiding judge, with a clear directive: enforce the king's laws and stamp out superstition with iron certainty. Among the accused were some familiar names: Alizon Device, James Device, Anne Whittle Chattox, Anne Redfern, Anne Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, John and Jane Balcock, Alice Gray, and more. Each had been implicated by confession, rumour, or the fateful words of a child. The testimonies were chilling, not because they were elaborate, but because they were believed. The court relied heavily on the statements of the accused themselves, many of whom had confessed under duress, fear, or illness, and the devastating account of Jennet Device. Imagine it, a small girl, 9 years old, standing on a table before a full courtroom, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering, and she points to her mother. Her mother Elizabeth, and says she's seen her converse with a black dog that spoke in a man's voice. She claims her mother bewitched a neighbour's child to death. She describes familiars and spirits with disturbing clarity. And her mother's response? A wail that echoes through the chamber. She denies it, she begs, she collapses, sobbing. Educated and from a wealthy family, her presence among the accused was an anomaly. To some, she was collateral damage, perhaps caught in local feuds or named out of jealousy. She refused to confess, but her silence was interpreted as pride, or worse, guilt. Others, like Anne Redfern, faced damning testimony from neighbours and relatives. Anne, the daughter of Chattox, was accused of crafting clay effigies to cause death. Though she denied the charges, the weight of superstition was against her. And those who had confessed before, James Device and Elizabeth Device Chattox, they sealed their own fate with words they could no longer retract. By the end of the trial, 10 people were found guilty and sentenced to death. One woman, Alice Gray, was acquitted. Her case, still debated by historians, lacked a dramatic testimony that ensnared the others. Her survival stands as a grim exception, but the others, their journey would not end in the dungeon, but at the gallows. On August 20th, just 2 days after the trial, the condemned witches of Pendle Hill were led to their fates. The hill was a cruel and unforgiving place for such an end. The wind howled across the exposed moors, carrying with it the weight of the trial's conclusion. There would be no clemency, no mercy. Lancashire's gallows stood in the stark contrast to the beauty of the surrounding countryside, looming grim and exposed. It wasn't just a place of execution, it was a spectacle, a warning to all those who might dare to defy the church, the law, and the natural order of things. The first to face the noose was James Device and Elizabeth Device. The Device family, who had set this entire tragedy into motion, now stood as the first victims. The child accused of witchcraft, Jennet, watched from the crowd as her mother and brother were led to the gallows. She would later testify that her mother was a witch, but was it the weight of superstition that had turned her against her own flesh and blood? Or was it the manipulation of fear? The answer to this, unfortunately, remains lost, just like the tension in the air that day. Elizabeth, frail and beaten by the interrogations, was hanged with her son. But it's believed that the children, whose words ignited the whole affair, saw it as a twisted justice. For Jennet, standing there watching her mother die, it must have been a moment of both terrible clarity and confusion. In that crowd, it was not just the dead that were mourned, but the living, the motherless, the lost, and the broken. Then came Anne Whittle, known as Chattox. She had been a cunning woman, feared and respected in equal measure. Her reputation for witchcraft had spread far across Lancashire, her dark reputation fueled by years of gossip and superstition. Chattox, like many others, had been accused of maleficium, causing death and harm through magic. Her daughter, Anne Redfern, also faced execution. In her final moments, they were marked by the same cold eyes, that accused her mother. But the one whose story who would become the most enduring, the most tragic, was Anne Nutter. Anne Nutter was unlike the others, a woman of means, a landowner, and not the stereotypical image of a witch that the people would be conditioned to expect. Her refusal to confess was seen as a form of defiance, an act of refused to confess, even to save her life, made her an enigma, an eerie and tragic figure whose death could not easily be explained. Her life had been a puzzle, just as her death became one. The others, Catherine Hewitt, John and Jane Bulcock, and Alice Gray, followed soon after, meeting their end at the gallows. Those who had confessed, those who had offered up their souls in exchange for a chance at life, had their fates sealed long before the trapdoors fell. Their deaths marked the culmination of a moment in time, a moment when fear and superstition had run rampant, sweeping away those who were different, those who stood out, those who had once been powerful or influential, but were now no more than victims of a witch hunt. The aftermath was just as brutal as the trials. Though Jennet Device had played her part in sending her family to their deaths, she too would live to see her life unravel. The burden of what she had done, whether through her own belief or innocence, or the sheer manipulation of the power of those around her, would haunt her for the rest of her life. As for the others who witnessed the events, they were believed in the witch's guilt or not. They would carry the mark of the trials with them forever. The legacy of Pendle would become a symbol of how easily hysteria could spread, how quickly the line between fact and fiction, superstition and truth could blur. The witches of Pendle were not just condemned by the courts, they were condemned by the world that they lived in. And through executions, and though their lives ended, the legends didn't. They only grew. The memory of Pendle Hill would be forever tied to witchcraft, to death, and to the inexplicable fear that still lingers in the shadow of history. The trials had sparked a chain reaction that echoed through time. For generations, Pendle Hill would be seen as the place where the old ways were cast aside, where a community turned on itself, and where the dark spectre of witchcraft would never truly fade. Even now, centuries later, the hill still watches, and those who walk its slopes perhaps even unknowingly carry with them the heavy weight of its past. The Pendle Hill witch trials are a story of folklore tragedy and of fear and lives lost to the superstition and suspicion. But they are also a story of how the past shapes the present, how fear can echo through time, twisting the shadows we still walk in. And in the silence of Pendle Hill, where the wind howls and the crows circle above, there's still something that remembers and something whispers in the wind. Something that calls out even now to be heard. The executions at Pendle Hill may have ended long ago, but the legacy of the witches who died there, of the accusations, the fear and the injustice, have never truly faded. The winds that whip across the hill seem to carry the weight of those lost lives, the weight of that moment in time. It's as if Pendle Hill holds its memory, something ancient buried deep within its very soil. To this day, The land around the hill is shrouded in an eerie silence. In the centuries since, Pendle has become more than just a landmark. It's a legend, an Well, perhaps it's because their story is about more than just the past. It's about fear, about time when society could turn on its most vulnerable with little more than a whisper. It's about suspicion running rampant, about how quickly the line between friend and enemy can blur, and how easily a community can be torn apart by its own paranoia. It's also about how a legacy of injustice can ripple through the generations. In a world so often divided by religion, class and superstition, Pendle Hill became a symbol of just how far that fear could spread. But in the aftermath of those trials, what of the community that remained? What of those who lived on after the hangings, those who had witnessed it all? How did their lives change? Well, historians' voices from the time tell us that many in the local area struggled to move forward. Their communities scarred by the loss of so many of whom had been innocent. With the trials over and the executions carried out, people began to wonder if they had made a mistake. Had they destroyed innocent lives? Or were the victims simply paying the price for sins of the old world? For the families of those condemned, the legacy was even more tragic. While Jennet Device had played a pivotal role in the convictions, there are very few records about what happened to her afterward. Some suggest that she lived her life in relative obscurity, while others believe that the weight of what she had done haunted her until her final days. Could she ever fully have understood the consequences of her actions? Could she have known as a child what sending her own family members to the gallows would mean for her heart and soul? Pendle Hill became a place of pilgrimage for both those drawn to its tragic history and those who sought to understand the dark forces at play. As the centuries passed, stories of the witches grew, until the line between historical record and mythology blurred. By the 19th century, a revival of witchcraft and the occult led Pendle Hill to be romanticised. No longer just a symbol of fear and superstition, they became the subject of fascination. The once vilified women of Pendle were now seen as figures of rebellion, people who fought against the establishment, against the forces of authority. In the modern world, some would even view them as victims of a larger system of oppression, and in their tragic end they became martyrs in the eyes of those who believed in magic and the old ways. Alongside this fascination, Pendle Hill became haunted, both literally and metaphorically. For years, locals and visitors alike have reported strange occurrences on the hill. Whispers on the wind, shadows that seem to move unnaturally, and the feeling of being watched. Some claim that the spirits of those who died during the witch trials still linger there, their restless souls unable to find peace. There have been reports of ghostly apparitions, particularly near the old chapel and the site of the original gallows. A figure dressed in an old-fashioned clothing, often believed to be Alice Nutter, appears to those who wander too close to the edge of the hill. Others have felt a cold, unnatural chill, one that follows them as they walk, as though the past is reaching out to touch the present. Perhaps it's this sense of unfinished business that keeps Pendle Hill so firmly lodged in our collective consciousness. The trials, the execution, the whispered confessions, these are not just the events of a distant past. They are a reminder of how easily we let fear guide us to the darkest places. Monument to the dead, but it also stands as a monument to a legacy of fear, a reminder that history is never truly over. The land remembers, the wind whispers, and the hill watches. If you stand at the base of Pendle Hill today, the landscape before you is not so different from what it was 4 centuries ago. The hills are all green beneath the ever-changing sky, and the stark beauty of the land seems to stretch endlessly. But as you climb the slopes or gaze from a nearby village, one thing becomes clear: the echoes of the past are never far behind. Pendle Hill is no longer just the site of witch trials. It is a place where history, myth, and the present day collide. Today, tourists, scholars, and enthusiasts alike come to learn the truth of the Pendle witches, or to be connected to something deeper, something more intangible. To understand why Pendle Hill still commands such fascination, we must consider how the past has been remembered, and how it continues to resonate with those who visit. In the modern day, Pendle's story has evolved into something that spans memories and mythology. With the trial survivors, both those who condemned and those who left behind, now portrayed in the various lenses. But what has been the lasting legacy of this infamous chapter of English history? For some, Pendle represents the darkness of superstition, a time where fear of the unknown allowed for the most gruesome miscarriages of justice. For others, it symbolises resilience, the courage of those who were wrongly accused and condemned under the weight of a society gripped by paranoia. But modern Pendle has become a place where the past is continually reimagined. Through literature, folklore, and even popular media, the Pendle witches have been mythologised, elevated from victims of hysteria to symbols of defiance, or even misunderstood heroines of the oppressed. One of the ways in which Pendle witch trials are remembered today is through the Pendle Witch Trail. This path takes visitors on the tour of the key landmarks associated with the trials, retracing the steps of the accused as they were brought to trial and executed. The trail itself winds through the villages of Barley, Newchurch and Colne, leading up the hill where the witches were said to have met their fate. As you walk along the trail, you encounter information boards, some simple but evocative plaques, others more elaborate, recounting the individuals involved and the chilling details of their lives. Visitors are invited to ponder the fate of the accused, to ask questions about justice, and to reflect on the complex web of fear and betrayal that led to their deaths. For many, the Pendle Witch Trail offers more than just history. It becomes an experience. Tourists stand where those condemned stood, peering out across the same moors that must have seemed endless to those who walked to their doom. Some report feeling an eerie stillness on the hill, as if the ghosts of the past still linger in the air. Others visit on a misty day, when the landscape takes on a more mysterious quality, a visual representation of how the Pendle witches have become not only historical figures, but legendary ones. Tied forever to the land they were so tragically associated with. Pendle Hill is also a site of interest for those who follow modern witchcraft and neo-pagan practices. Over the years, the hill has been adopted as a symbol by Wiccans and practitioners of the occult, who see the land as sacred or spiritually significant. Many who identify as witches today make pilgrimage to Pendle, paying homage to the ancient stories of magic, power, and resistance associated with the land. To these modern practitioners, Pendle is not just the site of the Pendle witch trials, against the forces that tried to silence them. There are even small rituals held on the hill during significant dates, like Samhain or the anniversary of the trials, to honour the memory of those accused and executed. However, the connection between modern witchcraft and the Pendle witches is not without its complexities. While some practitioners view Pendle as a sacred space, others see it as a grave reminder of the dangers of superstition. There's an ongoing tension between respecting the victims and romanticising the lives of those who suffered. The witches of Pendle are remembered in many different ways by those who come to the hill, and how we choose to interpret their legacy says a lot about how we view the role of fear and superstition in our own lives today. But the witches of Pendle have not been forgotten by the world of popular culture either. Countless books, plays, films and television series have drawn inspiration from their tragic tale. In fiction, they're often portrayed as tragic, misunderstood figures, or as symbols of a time when women's autonomy was feared and violently suppressed. Pendle's witches have become archetypes, almost a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when a society allows fear to take control. For example, in the realm of historical fiction, authors have expanded the story of Pendle into sweeping narratives that bring long-lost women back to life, breathing complex personalities and motivations into their historical counterparts. Writers take the bare facts of their lives and transform them into stories of magic, resistance and transformation, shaping the legacy of Pendle witches into something that speaks to the needs and desires of modern readers. One particularly well-known fictional portrayal is in the novel The Witches of Pendle by Gillian Hammer, which weaves together historical research with fictionalised accounts, adding new layers to the tragedy and legacy of the witches and exploring the intricacies of the trials. The story of the Pendle witches also speaks to more than just the past. It holds lessons for us today. Pendle's legacies remind us of the dangers of mob mentality, of how easily a society can turn on its most vulnerable members, particularly women, in times of uncertainty or fear. In the witch trials, it was class and gender that portrayed significant roles in determining who was accused. Poor, marginalised women, often isolated and with limited power, became easily targets when suspicion began to spread. This too is something that resonates in today's world, where witch hunts, and literal and metaphorical, are still happening in various forms. From internet mobs to real-world persecution, Pendle serves as a reminder that even in our modern world, we must guard against the same forces that tore through Lancashire in 1612. The consequences of fear-based persecution can be far-reaching, and the Pendle's witches' haunting legacy continues to serve as a sobering warning. Pendle Hill, its witches, the trials of 1612, have become more than just a dark chapter. They are living, breathing symbols, carrying with them the complexities of justice, gender, power, and fear that still resonate today. What was once a grim episode of witch hunts has evolved into a broader reflection of the ways in which human nature and society confront the unknown. Pendle stands, the moorland as eerie as ever. The legacy of the Pendle witches woven deeply into its soil. Their names may not have been silenced by the hangman's noose, but their story, their struggle, their suffering, their defiance continues to echo in the shadows of the hill. And in this way, the Pendle witches are not but across the world. For every grim tale told, there is something in these women's stories that resonates with us on a deep human level. A reminder of the fragility of justice, the strength of community, and the consequences of fear. When the Pendle witches were condemned, their lives were reduced to mere whispers of accusations. But today, we look back at them, not just as victims of a ruthless system, but as symbols. Symbols of the powerless, and resistance and resilience of misunderstanding and empowerment. The events of 1612 cannot be undone, but they have forced us to reflect on the role of fear and the ways in which society creates monsters of the unknown. So what is the legacy of Pendle? The Pendle witches have been mythologised. Their names, Alizon Device, Old Demdike, and others have become part of local folklore and are often remembered as tragic martyrs. The women who stood trial and faced their fate represent the misunderstood and those who did not fit in the neatly constructed roles society has carved out for them. In a time where women, particularly those in rural areas, were subject to superstition and suspicion, any deviation from the norm was seen as dangerous, and so their fate was sealed by their very otherness. The victims of Pendle were not just accused of witchcraft, they were accused of being outcasts, of challenging the established order in ways that seemed threatening to the local social, religious and norms of the time. They were often poor, marginalised, and women who lived in ways the ruling classes didn't understand. Old Demdike, for instance, was feared because of her knowledge of folk medicine and healing practices, skills that passed down through generations that were seen as a direct challenge to the authority of the church and its teachings. Her cunning was much a part of the story as her supposed dealings with the devil. Today, many see these women as martyrs for the oppressed, for those who dared to live outside the societal confines of their time. They symbolised struggle, an ongoing struggle against patriarchy, superstition and the dangers of social conformity. What happens when fear takes the reins of decision making? In the cases we've seen, especially with the Pendle witches, it was not evidence, reason or even truth that determined the fate of the accused. It was power of rumour, religious zeal and societal pressure. In such a climate, accusations were enough to condemn, and the testimonies of the accused were treated as gospel truth, regardless of how those confessions were obtained. This raises the difficult issue of false confessions, which played a significant role in those witch trials, Many of the accused confessed, whether out of fear, coercion, or the belief that their confessions would lead to a more merciful fate. But we have to ask ourselves, how many of these confessions were born not from guilt, but from fear? Fear of their gruesome fate. As we reflect on the trials today, we find ourselves wondering, could it happen again? How many innocents have been condemned? Remember the human cost of witch hunts, the lives destroyed by paranoia and the lives that were lost unjustly. And yet we also remember the strength of those women whose stories continue to inspire us, whose names continue to be spoken even when they were condemned to silence. We are left to wonder what would happen if we truly listened to the whispers of Pendle. If we allowed ourselves to learn from history, to reflect on the cost of fear, and to question how justice is dispensed. The Pendle witches may no longer be here, but their legacy will continue to echo on, reminding us the importance of justice, understanding, and the power of individual agency. The wind still carries their names. The whisper of Pendle will not fade. And in these echoes we find the lesson, for we too must decide how we will answer when fear calls. And as the wind whispers through Pendle Hill, we are left with more questions than answers. But isn't that the way with most folklore? What if the accused had been treated with compassion instead of superstition? What if the justice of the day had been grounded in reason rather than fear? And what if, just for a moment, the lives of those 12 women and the man whose name was cursed alongside theirs had been valued for what they were? Human beings, flawed, maybe, but deserving the same dignity we all wish for ourselves. The Pendle witch trials were not merely an episode of history. They were a mirror reflecting the darkness that lies within all societies. Fear, greed, jealousy. These can all cloud our judgment, warp our perception, and twist our sense of justice into something unrecognisable. And yet, despite the horrific outcome, there's something we can learn from this. For in their stories, the witches of Pendle still live on, not just as victims of a dark past, but as symbols. Symbols of the danger of superstition, of misunderstanding, of blind allegiance to authority. And as much as their trials mark the end of their lives, they mark the beginning of a much larger conversation. Today, Pendle Hill still stands, a witness to centuries of change. To new generations who visit, some seek out the ghosts of the past, others to feel the weight of history on their shoulders. But there's something else here too, a legacy that continues to reverberate, not only in the rolling hills of Lancashire, but across the world, in the fight for justice, equity, and human dignity. As we leave this story behind and put the book back on the shelf, we must ask ourselves, are we listening to the whispers of the past, Are we paying attention to the stories of those who came before us, of those who were silenced by fear, superstition, and prejudice? And most importantly, are we willing to learn from them? We will remember Pendle not just as a place of fear and death, but as a place of reflection, where we too must confront our own sticking with me to the end of this video. This has been a subject I've wanted to cover for quite some time, but I wanted to give it justice. So until next time, keep listening, keep lore alive, and continue to explore the world with wonder.